Use it for a moment. Welcome back. We have the second panel. Take this with me.
Sunglasses.
Yeah. Can we lower the house lights?
Your turn. Yeah.
So we're going to go, the theme, I think, of a lot of the work on this report is fragmentation and how to sort of defrag this disk, in a sense. We've looked a little bit at fragmentation of science in the first panel and how we might integrate science a little bit. This second panel is about management, adaptive management, governance, how we might integrate the management of the system and maybe adaptively manage the system across different levels and types of governments. And then the third panel is on regulation and how we might bring together some of the regulatory system to be a little bit more integrated and effective for strategic and long-term purposes. And over the break, someone noticed, well, you haven't completely integrated everything. And I said, well, we integrated it down to 3 panels and not to 300. So you can only expect us to do 90 or 90% of the work. So we're going to begin with, as we did with the panel before, with a question for each person, and then have some discussion among them. And then we'll quickly switch to the next panel. So you're not going to get a break between panels here, and neither will we. Just as an opening statement to start this off, the central issue that we have for reversing the declining conditions in the Delta is fragmentation of management and governance. The real question, I think, that comes from that is how can local, state, and federal governments work together on a very large, strategic, and complex problem that they all have narrower responsibilities for? I think it's quite arguable that all of the agencies are failing in their missions because we don't have an integrated approach to managing this problem. But every agency has very particular missions in resolving this issue that don't necessarily overlap or work well with others. For integrating science, we proposed a science JPA. For trying to integrate management, we're
yeah, they made a statement on integration and just left.
Well,
Will, where'd you go?
He apparently needed some coffee to stay awake through the droning on of the professor. He's looking for funding. Everyone was looking to you for funding, actually. That's a switch. For integrating management, we proposed that the Delta Stewardship Council lead in integrating management and adaptive management through a strong Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, this DPIC, I guess, or whatever the acronym is pronounced, that's already established in legislation, although we suggest expanding it to include some local agencies as well. So the first question goes to Phil Eisenberg. The Delta Stewardship Council is one of the few state agencies with broad authority in the Delta, but its authority and its funding remain quite limited. What is needed to make integration under the Interagency Implementation Committee effective, as opposed to another ineffective interagency coordination committee, as the quotation that you suggested from Harold Seidman called these interagency committees the crabgrass in the garden of government. Is this the best approach for integrating management, or are there more promising approaches?
I was going to nominate some of the other panelists as crabgrass, and I would simply be the gardener who would rip them out unsuccessfully. Look, this is America. Everybody believes they get to choose which laws get passed, which laws get enforced, and which laws apply to them. We're all like that. It doesn't matter who we are, what our positions are. We're individualistic. But we demand efficiency from government. I have no idea why anybody thinks it is possible to have unlimited personal choice and efficiency at the same time, but that is very much what we do as a society. So I've kind of come to the conclusion that you're asking the wrong question. You know, when we walked up here on the stage, I said, where do you want me to sit? Which seems like a pretty simple question. And you say, anywhere. You're a scientist, Jay. You're supposed to give clear precise, actionable direction.
In a chair.
In a chair. Oh, good. Look. You've got laws passed that say pretty much what we all know. There are a lot of governmental agencies, state, federal, and local, with shared legal responsibility in the Delta. There have been endless laws passed, budget language in the state of California, calling for everybody to cooperate, agree, and all of that. But the fact of the matter is, there is no single issue in the Delta. There is a multiplicity of issues, a multiplicity of entities, and 38 million individual people in California who, if they have any interest in the subject, have a lot of different views on what should be done. I don't think in America and in California there's going to be any miracle solution to come down that will solve it. I'm flattered that you would say the Delta Stewardship Council and poor Randy Fiorini, who's going to chair the Delta Plan Implementation Committee, is the person to bring everybody together. Kind of like punishment for all of your sins, real or imagined. It doesn't work that way. The backdrop for this is the water and water problems of California, the environmental problems in the Delta, and how they relate together. I just give you my instinct. We are so lost in talking about how to improve processes that we forget that a whole lot of things are already going on, but more importantly, what the collective entities need to do is start somewhere and do something. And in politics in California, everybody always asked, well, okay, I want you to answer every question I have about any possibility I can think of that I might not like that results from your action. And once you've answered it to my satisfaction, we'll talk about whether you should proceed. Whether it's a water facility, an ecosystem restoration, building a school, a highway, new curriculum program in the elementary schools, it's all the same. Well, there are opportunities to apply what you guys wrote about in this report that are just sitting out there and waiting. Mark and I have talked about this. You know the courts are, in the biological opinion litigation involving salmon and smelt, have essentially started granting a one-year extension with the right to renew on the enforcement of the existing biots. And that's pursuant to the request of state and federal agencies for a delay so they can develop an adaptive management plan. Something that everybody says they're for, that no one can define with clarity. And all the interest groups want to write it so that they get to control the outcome. Well, if we can't do it in a court setting, we can't do it anywhere else. I just suggest to you, Jay, if you want to focus down the discussion and test the ideas, I'd look at that litigation, what Mark and the federal agencies are doing on that litigation. They have to report to a court every 12 months, and they're back February of 2014, if memory serves, and they've got to show progress on developing an adaptive management plan. Now, this room is full of the usual suspects, the unindicted co-conspirators of the water wars. And I think the willingness of the folks in this room to easily and simply agree to an adaptive management program is -0. So the question is for agencies, and this is truly a governmental agency program and responsibility. Can you use that opportunity in a way that's meaningful? And this is where I think some of your ideas tend to play. I do agree. Peter Goodwin said very thing. Forget Jeff Mount's colorful combat science, which is a delicious phrase and talks about a serious issue. The fact of the matter is, whether you're a scientist who believes that the scientific method is the most important determinant, or you're a water district who wants water that says, oh Christ, I've got to hide behind good science to get what I want. It doesn't matter what your attitude is. The political deal, whether in that litigation or a BDCP or the next California explosion on water in public policy, it will involve a much higher and clearer involvement of science in the process, and everybody has said the same thing. So the point is, get to the argument of what that means, not to the argument about abstractly whether miracles happen. And you know, I think that's right. We imply miracles. There are no miracles in this business. So for PPIC, next week, tell us, does science get involved in big public projects early, or is it an after-the-fact, shoot the wounded, and condemn inaction? And I'll bet you most people, most scientists would say, yeah, we ought to be in early. How often? Every minute? No, not every minute. How often? Just tell me how often. How do you get involved in a project? How does it play out? Does science have anything to tell us about the share of big capital improvement projects around America, the share that can be identified as to the cost for scientific involvement? Now, that's the way I do it. Whether it's a Joint Powers Authority, whether it's Delta Stewardship Council doing it, whether it's poor Randy who has these discussions, that's less relevant than starting somewhere with something real, because the message is the voters, the people of California, care about a reliable water supply and doing something good for the Delta ecosystem. They do not care about the endless things that consume our lives. And so I'm happy you identified us. We'll do the best we can. We'll kibitz, holler, yell, whatever it is you want us to do to help, but it won't solve all of the problems, as you well know. But with hard work, we're moving that way. That's the other thing is Americans have the world's shortest attention span on issues. And look over history. We have been battling about these things for as long as we've been a state, over 160 years. We'll battle about them forever, but we are slowly seeing decreased per capita use of water. We're slowly seeing improvements in the water quality. We are slowly seeing efficiencies in water system, but we don't know how to create water that nature doesn't provide. And so how you make that work is do a whole bunch of things at one time, and you spend a lot of money, and you get people to adjust. Last point, I'm stopping. All of us fear the voters, the ratepayers, because they're pretty demanding. They want what they want, and they'd prefer not to pay much for it, and they expect us to work out all the details, and you leave them alone. And I think our conversation has to be directed out there, science conversation too, not just us, to inform the public about what's going on, not the details of what we care about, but how they can get a more reliable water supply and improved Delta ecosystem. That's what they care about. That's what we should be talking about. Is that what you wanted me to say?
I think you did a marvelous job of changing the question.
Well, Mark and I said we wanted to be on the last panel. We had a lot to say on the last panel. So anyway.
So you see that the real decision-making and the real integration is going to be much more decentralized and driven more by courts.
Well, let me ask you. There are many approaches to it. The simplest solution is identify every governmental agency with some authority in the Delta. Remove from every governmental agency except one all that authority. Transfer all that authority to one agency. Can you do that?
I don't think that extreme is likely to happen.
Okay. So if you can't do that, then what do? Well, identify 6 governmental agencies that you really like, transfer the... Now, do you think that'll happen too?
No.
Okay. So you've already reduce the parameter of the discussion to the crabgrass in the garden of government, the interagency committees, the cooperation, the coordination. And, you know, one of my favorite conservative academics is James Wilson, and he kind of said, you know, I write a lot about government and bureaucracy, but he kind of says, you know, the screwy American system seems to be what people like. They don't change it.
Yeah.
They don't change it. They must, if not tolerate it, like it or something. And I think we're stuck in this morass. But every once in a while, in the history of California and the water issues, society makes a jump, a change, a motion. And you can feel it out there, something's happened. And I understand in politics, we only want to talk about a yes tunnel, no tunnel. That's nonsense. There's so many other things going on in the water world that are important and significant that the politics is decades behind the policy discussion. and we ought to change that around.
Oh, that's a very good point, I think.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to chime in on this?
I'm afraid to.
We have a 10-foot pole back here. Let me change the order a little bit then, because I would like to victimize Mark next. Because the question that we had in mind for him was can the State Water Project and the larger BDCP effort work together with the many other authorities and the many other issues that are involved in the Delta? And so I think this falls in nicely the way next is after Phil's framing of the issue. So please, Mark, if you have any thoughts.
I told Phil that I didn't bother preparing any remarks because he was on my panel. So I could just make this up right now. But I've got a love-hate relationship with the word integration. I was thinking about this earlier as well. First time I heard it in my professional life was back in 1994 when integrated resources planning became the vogue in California water planning. I immediately got myself an assignment to go work on that for the Department of Water Resources and thought it was pretty cool. I still love the notion of integration. And we went on to integrated watershed planning. I got involved with integrated regional water management, integrated flood planning, and now we're wrapping it all together in something we call integrated water management, period. On the other hand, I hate integration because I can't tell you how many panels I've been on, how many letters I've responded to that have started with the notion that I'm failing to integrate. So what the heck does that mean? You know, how do you measure integration, I guess, is one of the key questions of my life, but that's my problem, I guess. But my conclusion is that integration is a state of mind. And it works best when it's in your self-interest to integrate. So I'm going to go back to a talk that Chuck Bonham and I had at the Aqua luncheon yesterday. If you're going to buy into the notion of sustainable water management as a modern-day California water manager, you understand that reliable water supplies go along with a healthy ecosystem. So those co-equal goals are ingrained upon you. It's not a matter of me trying to accomplish my mission in spite of somebody else, but how do we do it collaboratively and constructively so that we both succeed, because that's the only option. So I bristle at the notion of combat science and you know, this notion that we still have water managers out there trying to sell cigarettes to kids. I don't see it in my professional life. I see you know, a lot of concern from water managers that have particular responsibilities back to their ratepayers. If a regulation is put into place that affects their interests, they want to understand why. And we've had good conversations over the last year about explaining the rationale behind decisions. And in fact, there's a prime piece of evidence here. The water projects forewent about 800,000 acre feet of water in January, February, March of this year to provide for this reverse flow regulation to protect delta smelt and migrating salmon. Nobody litigated. Why? Well, I think probably folks are second guessing that now, but the main purpose was to give collaboration a chance so that we can actually have a conversation about the science that is driving these regulations, because collaboration and litigation cannot coexist. That's the other life lesson from the last few years. So I was trying to draw this conceptual model because that's what I've learned from scientists over the last decade. If you start with the notion that integration is good, we want to achieve integration, and that requires collaboration, then you've got to avoid litigation. And in order to avoid litigation, you've got to have regulation that is participatory, transparent, so people understand it. So there's a cycle there somewhere, and I don't know if it's cycling up or down at this point, but I'm going to work on my conceptual model and get it published. But my main premise here is that to achieve this model of governance that's going to make the spiral go in the right direction, We've got to be able to achieve a balance between having one agency that's accountable, so you've got one person to hang, versus having the foundational buy-in from all of the interests so that they believe in the regulation or they can tolerate the regulation because they understand that there's a basis in it. So I don't know if how to achieve integration. I told you I've been trying to do it since 1994 and apparently haven't succeeded. But I know that it's essential, and you know it when you've got it.
Right.
And we just have to keep pushing.
There's a wonderful old paper by Aaron Wildowski on planning, which is a little bit similar to integration. The title of the paper is, "If Planning is Everything, Maybe It's Nothing." And I think it's the same applies to integration, that you'd like to have more of it, but if that's all you're focusing on, then you probably have nothing. Would anyone else like to echo in on that? So how do you see BDCP fitting into all of this?
Well, you know, I think that's going to play out over years and decades, frankly, and it's, you know, I've got this great organization chart that,
Hold it up, they can see it.
that Paul Hulliker handed me as I walked up here.
Yeah, we have the answer.
You know, just from BWR's perspective, it's not just BDCP. It's
Right.
the Central Valley Flood Plan. It's the California Water Plan. You know, we've got to make all of this stuff fit together. And I believe in crawl, walk, run. That's another one I've learned recently. So I don't think we should try to solve this in one big, giant leap. And frankly, we're working right now on this collaborative effort among Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, Reclamation, DWR, and some of the other parties to litigation to see how we might establish better collaboration in the foundational science that drives water operations. That's got to fit with broader science for the Delta. It's got to fit with what I'm doing in my department on flood management and broader California water planning. So I'm, as I say, I'm skeptical of coming up with the perfect organization structure that's going to solve these problems for us. And it's more, to me, establishing the motivations that will drive our behavior in that direction. And perhaps future generations will perfect the organizational model, but at the end of the day, I'm a pragmatist, and I'm looking to make some baby steps here.
So the decisions really are going to be made by motivated people more than by an organizational structure.
Absolutely.
I think that's probably true. Thanks. Let's move on to Campbell Ingram. I'm representing really a lot of local counties, I think. How can the many local governments involved in the Delta be part of meaningful adaptive management and the larger governance of the system and participation in the Common Science Program? It's a lot to ask of small local governments to be involved in these things. It takes a lot of time and effort and a different purview sometimes. What would be the most effective way for local, state, and federal agencies to work effectively together, particularly for ecosystem outcomes?
Well, first, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Delta Conservancy, just very quickly, we are the new state conservancy for the Delta. Our role is to be a lead agency for ecosystem restoration and economic development in the Delta, but we're supposed to do that as a state conservancy. So really to be a partner to the Delta community as well. So it puts a slightly different role for us, and there are some expectations that we will be an integrator and a coordinator within the Delta. So we try to understand the Delta perspective and represent that perspective. So in terms of the first question, adaptive management, I think, absolutely they can play an active role. They should play an active role. Their constituencies that the local governments represent have the greatest impact from everything that we will do in the Delta. I think the first challenge to getting them to effectively engage is helping them understand what adaptive management really is all about. Currently, they view adaptive management as sort of the agency get out of jail free card. If they need more in the future, they'll take it through adaptive management. I think there's a lot of work to be done to help them understand that in a very complex ecosystem, we have no choice but to manage things adaptively. And what that means, what are the bounds of that? How do we actually put that in practice, maybe with examples? But I think as we educate them and bring them along to the value of that, they will want to participate, and I think they can be very effective and meaningful participants. So To the second question, how do we coordinate and integrate all these? I think there's just been some great comments. I think, Phil's recognition of all the agencies that are actively engaged here. I think you can add another layer of complexity too when you look at all the programs that exist. CVPIA first, then ERP, and now FERPA, BDCP, the Delta Plan, Central Valley Plan of Flood Control. In each one of those, all the same agencies are working in that regard too. So it just adds this layer of complexity, and that is just as Phil and Mark have said, that's just the reality of where we are. I don't think we will be able to break that structure down in the future. One of the things that we're trying to do is, I think, is hopeful in that to have an effective program for restoration moving forward, we do have to start to bring the groups together to have these discussions. We spent a lot of time planning. It's time to shift the focus to implementation. And the first step there, I believe, is just bringing the groups together to have these discussions. We've started what we call our Delta Restoration Network. The intent is to bring all the agencies that do restoration together, as well as the Delta community, to really start to focus on how, where, when, and why do we do restoration, how do we track it, how do we make sure we can tell the public and the legislature at any given time where we are. And we view that really as a component of the Stewardship Council's implementation committee. It's sort of the restoration component of that. And I think one of the things that can be really helpful in this regard is starting to unify all those organizations around a fairly simple framework that ultimately turns into an implementation plan. In that framework, we can articulate what we know about restoration today, those things that are helpful. The SFEI Historical Ecology Report is coming out. That's very informative about how we do restoration in the future, as are the DRERIP models. And in a framework, we can articulate that and talk about how projects that come through in the very near term can move forward with that guidance. We can also articulate the tools that we think we need moving forward. We talk about the need for landscape scale models and maybe regional hydrodynamic modeling so we understand the impact of change in tidal dynamics as we do habitat restoration. And we can talk about those tools and others and what we need and how we get there over time. But with a relatively high-level, simplistic framework, it starts to create a unifying understanding of where we need to go into the future. And I think that's something that we can really achieve without a great deal of effort. We are convening these meetings. People have interest. People are willing to come and participate in the meetings. That's encouraging. And I think given the complexity of all these agencies together, that's probably the way we need to move forward.
So do you see this unifying framework sort of emerging out of these many decentralized processes, or?
I think that it would be relatively easy to get a high-level framework, to bring the groups together, to start to articulate this high-level framework. And I think the reason that is easy is because you're also articulating what you need into the future and how maybe you get there. No doubt it's challenging, but I think the higher level and the more simplistic you start to make it. I think performance measures is a really good example. Performance measures, there have been hundreds of them discussed, and it's been a decade-long process to try to get to some good performance measures for the system. But for the public and the legislature, other systems have distilled those down to 5 or 8 real driving ones that people can understand. So I think you start at that level and then you build the complexity as you need it. But all the while recognizing that it has to happen concurrently. You have to do the planning and you have to get things moving at the same time. And you have to bring people along to understand that planning and, to some extent, the process creates efficiency and cost savings. Absent that, we're just out there in a shotgun approach. And we've done that before with the CalFed ERP program and the CVPIA program. We're going to be very careful not to repeat that. And I think I like the simplicity mantra.
I think that's going to be necessary. I agree. Did you want to add something to that, Will? You were nodding.
Yes, I do, but I'll do it in my general.
Okay. I guess I'm seeing a lot of chaos, which I guess is normal for the system. In terms of, I worry about trying to see a unifying framework emerge when we are, in a sense, being over-processed, because every agency has at least one, and when they have many programs, they might have several processes. Mark, your agency has probably half a dozen processes or a dozen processes at any given time. How do you see that emerging? Is there some sort of political leadership that's coming from the governor's office, or just some inspired individual in the form of a chair of some committee, or something that will sort of catalyze this to come together?
Well, Will can attest to this. If it's just a matter of political leadership from the governor's office, we got plenty of that, so we can provide that in spades. You know, in my mind, this is probably just too general of an answer, but I don't see any resistance from coordinating all of these efforts. My concern is that by trying to make them conform, you lose the basic buy-in from the bottom up.
Yeah.
And that leads to isolation and litigation. Back to my
Your bad
conceptual
cycle.
model.
Right?
So there's the balance there. And so I think that evolving towards a more unified structure is, there's a lot to be said for just taking small steps towards that.
I want to just add a note. I don't think Mark toots his own horn enough on this. DWR, I know the word integration has problems, but the notion that DWR has now been pushing for 20 years of regional self-reliance and integrated choices and options available to people has, I think, captured a lot of the professional attention and respect, and we underrate that importance. Because that and the fact that now everybody says, oh, I'm only talking about water, reliable water, I'm not just talking about more water, is part of how mature societies deal with finite resources and allocate them. And I think that's underrated in importance. I think that, Mark, you actually shouldn't underrate it. You know, integration may trouble you as a word, but those activities best expressed in the last 4 water management plan updates are as the closest thing you have to a clearly articulated, albeit generalized approach to water management. Without that, man, you think it's
been
bad
very
now.
successful.
Without that, it would be
right.
insane.
Right. If you look at the amount of water markets, conjunctive use, water conservation, it's been a very successful approach, and very decentralized.
I can guarantee you that even though I don't have a metric for integration, I'm not going to stop using the word.
I got it.
Will?
Yeah, I'd like to both offer my own observations, but in so doing, respond to all of the comments thus far from Phil and Mark. And first of all, let me, from my perspective, and I should confess, I represent and am employed by one of the combatants. I'm with NOAA. So we administer the Salmonid program here in the Central Valley, amongst other things. So that's my bias, if you will. A couple of core points, one of which is a point of, from my perspective, a point of substantial optimism. And what I mean by that is I think that there are the ingredients for some relatively immediate and significant reforms and improvements in the way we do business, and they're right in front of us. So all we need to do is make some pretty easy choices, and I frankly think they are pretty easy choices about utilizing the tools that are smack dab in front of us and getting on with it. And so one is a significant point of optimism. And let me explain why. First of all, let me bring a few lessons from other places as to why this optimism, I think, is well grounded. I have spent decades also in other big, complicated basin controversies, and in particular, I spent a hell of a lot of time on the Columbia Basin. And let me describe to you what has changed there. When I first went to work in NOAA fisheries, it was in the Pacific Northwest, and my main job was to deal with the Columbia Basin. because it threatened to be just a hellhole of controversy, coming on the ends of a very difficult spotted owl controversy that tore apart the Pacific Northwest and Northern California for maybe 8 to 10 years. At the time, I spent probably 70% of my time on Columbia Basin issues. Now back in a similar job or the same job, I spend about 5% of my time on Columbia Basin issues. And the reason, and that's a very good metric as to what has changed. What has changed is that we figured out, not perfectly, but we've made huge progress over the last 15 years in establishing and implementing the machinery that is necessary to try to improve the productivity and the performance of the systems that we administer in the Columbia Basin. Huge progress. So that I don't have to pay much attention to it anymore because it doesn't need to. And I want to describe what I think the essential ingredients are and why those ingredients are smack dab in front of us right now here in the Central Valley. First of all, on the performance side of things, how we doing in the Columbia Basin? The answer is we've set up a system that is governed largely by federal law. The core of the system is the federal Columbia River Power System that is owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. But the power from it is marketed by the Bonneville Power Administration. And that is the central drive shaft of the machine. The other major driver is ecological issues that are best represented by the application of the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, but mostly the ESA, that has fundamentally changed the way we operate the system over the last 20 years. That Endangered Species Act program has hydro, hatcheries, harvest, habitat in it. So it's got all the full meal deal. And it's governed by a set of macro performance standards that then get dropped into each of those major modules. How are we doing on the performance standards? We're doing incredibly well. And in particular, in the hydro system itself, they're exceeding survival standards for all of the salmonids from what had been prescribed in the buyout. So it's a huge progress. What are some of the ingredients? One is you need to identify your core institutional drivers. And in the Columbia case, it's the Bonneville Power Administration and the FCRPS because it's both the economic engine of the Pacific Northwest and it is central to rebuilding the ecology of the basin. And it's the bank. Two, you need real deep political incentives for collaboration. And you need the political leadership to make the choices that collaboration is to be preferred. You then, if you've decided that you're going to try to collaborate in order to effectuate some real reforms in how the system is run, then you need to put into place the basic elements of the program. And you all know them. And the PPIC report goes through it. Phil touched on some of them. Mark did too. You need the programmatic elements. You need governance structures. You need financing structures. You need technical and scientific capabilities. And I'll leave it there. But those are the big items. And you need to tackle these things at multiple scales. So it's not going to be one machine, one great Dux Machina from the sky that takes care of everything. It's going to be layered, and that's okay. It also doesn't have to be perfect. Don't worry about it. Don't sweat the details. So why are these ingredients right in front of us? From my perspective, what are the core institutional drivers? It's easy. It's called the State Water Project and the Federal Water Project. They are the FCRPS of the Central Valley. They are the economic engine. They affect the ecology, and they are central to the reforms that need to be made. And they are also the bank. So you need the political leadership of the state and federal water projects as your core driver that commits to change. Then you need to build around it the essential modules that you must collaborate with. And what are they? Again, you don't have to be too complicated, but it starts probably with the Endangered Species Act, because the Endangered Species Act is driving the operation of the system. And we also need to wrap in water quality issues, because water quality issues are going to be driving the system too. So get on with it. We know where we find the ESA authorities. We know where we find the water quality authorities. We know where we find the leadership and the structures that govern the state and federal water projects. Put them together. And then build around it. And build the institutional, programmatic, and scientific mechanisms that are going to be essential to success. And Mark and DWR and the Bureau of Reclamation and all of us other ancillary agencies are in the process of building that infrastructure as we speak, through the implementation of the BIOPS and the systems required by it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's right in front of us, and it's right there, and we are in fact launching into a reform structure that hopefully will take root. Campbell also touched on what I think is a vital issue of success, and it is from a technical and scientific perspective. It's settling out on a system to think about and measure and evaluate the health of the system we're trying to rebuild. Because if we all are using different metrics constantly, it's going to be really difficult to achieve the reforms, the efficiencies, the integrations that are essential. So building a common language, building a common set of measuring tools and metrics that can be used at multiple scales is really a vital component of success. And again, how far are we there? We're not there all the way, but we are building it, and it is there in front of us. So I want to emphasize that, one, it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple in some respects. Two, we've got the ingredients that we need right in front of us, and half of them, the leadership is sitting in this room today. Three, we have the political desire, recognition and desire that better integration of what we're trying to do is essential for success, and that we will make the political commitment to reform. And we've got the venues, institutional and otherwise, to effectuate that reform. So I'm actually quite optimistic that in 2013, 2014, 2015, you're going to see real change in how business is done in the basin, and that will be a good thing. And I'll stop there.
Okay. Anyone want to add to that? Hear, hear. Peace, love, and understanding. Lead the way.
It ain't easy. It's raucous at times.
Yeah.
And these decisions are hard because they're winners and losers. But they're unavoidable. You can either make them intentionally or you can make them by accident, but they're unavoidable.
I guess I would just add, though, I think you mentioned that we do have the venues. I think we need to steer more towards those venues because, excuse me, what I see happening throughout the system now is there are conversations about every facet of this happening in little satellites in different processes. And so there is definitely a need, I think, to bring those discussions together in a very focused and deliberate manner to get a better collective understanding about how we're going to address some of these issues.
I totally concur with that. Yeah. I didn't mean to suggest everything's perfect.
No,
Everything is by no means perfect, but the ingredients are there for some real progress.
Well, I would go back to, I think Ellen mentioned early on in her discussion, this is sort of PDCP-centric discussion, but we don't contest that PDCP is trying to solve the entire equation.
Right.
It's an important part of it, but we do need to figure out how to interact with the rest of the equation as we try to build this piece.
I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A from the broader audience here. We have someone right here.
Thank you. Bert Wilson, Public Water News Service. I want to take issue with a couple of things that Phil said. You said the American people have a choice. That may be true for the other 49 states, but not here in California. We can't vote on the tunnels. Jerry Brown has made this so there's no vote on it except maybe with a referendum, which I'm sure will happen as soon as the permit is issued. The other thing you said, water problems cause environmental problems. I have a solution for that. Leave more water in the Delta. Leave more water in the Delta. When they stopped the diversions in 2006, the fisheries came back in 2 years. That's all the science you have to know there. Leave more water in the Delta.
Apparently science has spoken. Yeah.
Do it. Bert, you're neither a lawyer nor a scientist, but you're a good critic of a lot of the stuff that goes on. The voters of California in 1960 authorized the State Water Project. They did it on the ballot. The authorization, although it was deeply contested and it only narrowly passed, contained language instructing and authorizing the construction of facilities to export water from north to south. Those of us northerners who didn't like it lost that fight, and that has not been reversed legally. That's what the governor means, and I think he's legally correct. The funding, however, requires acts of the legislature if public fundings are involved, and the citizens have a right to do a referendum funding measures as well. On the science stuff, the notion that, and this is a good illustration, I'm glad you brought it up, the notion is that, well, the water exports dropped in 2006, it was only some fish species, not all, popped up a little bit in the numbers, and that's all the science you need. No, Bert, that isn't all the science we need. Because if it were that simple, then all these hotshot scientists would come in and say, well, it's just that simple. You just have to stop the exports. The decline of the fisheries started before the turn of the 19th century. It is not just attributable to the pumps, because the human use of water is a use that all of us, north and south, and in the Delta, have done for years. We reconfigured the Delta, the habitat for fish species, to put farms and cities into the Delta region. And all of those cumulative impacts have led to deteriorating ecosystem conditions. And as the National Research Council said in that wonderful report last year, you can't guarantee to go back to a time that existed in 1850 or anything else. You can improve the situation if you work hard, but it requires all of us to acknowledge that our total social use of water has something to do with the conditions of the Delta. Not just point to people who we don't like and say it's their fault. That's gone. It's us. It's us. And it just seems to me that as you look for solutions and choices, you've got to at least open your mind to the possibility. I mean, when you came to our meeting, 3 months ago, and you said, I've rethought my position, I think that it's probably right, BDCP won't export more water. I was startled because heretofore you'd said something different. The point is, we're in a mess together as a society. We're going to get out of it as a society, or we're not going to get out of it at all. And all these complicated, confusing detailed processes are trying to improve a situation and move forward. And 50 years from now, new people will be having similar conversations on water and the environment and what to do then. And that's what all this is about. Some decisions are right, some decisions are wrong, no doubt about it. But it's the effort collectively moving forward that to me is a mark of a mature society.
Without a vote on a project like this, you're imposing higher water rates on people, and that's undemocratic.
Let's move on to the second question. Back here.
Okay. Hi, Doug Brown here, and just a question for Will. You were talking about launching into reform structure, and so it sounds interesting, but can you provide any more detail about who's part of that, how it gets integrated, how it manages what goes on in the Delta?
Yeah, I can sketch something quickly. Again, I think the heart of it has to be you have to build it around the main drivers. And the main drivers are the state and federal water projects. So the state and federal water project managers have to be at the center of the circle. You also have to have the other public agencies that are deeply responsible for some of the other main drivers in the system, meaning the water quality crowd, and the endangered species crowd. They have to be part of it. So that will define your initial essential components, but then you also have to build in to that process the other access for the key constituencies. You can do that in a number of different ways, but it's essential. That's the starting place. But in addition to it, getting to the scale issue, and this is where Campbell comes in, you've got to have in it, that's a region-wide structure. But within that structure and nested in it, and connected to it has to be more localized structures as well to enable and empower the local units to take on those activities that are most properly dealt with locally. And they need a mechanism to plug in. We've got it in the Columbia Basin where we've got 4 states, 13 treaty tribes, and multiple local governments, and we have structured a governance capability that does have the layers that builds in county, local farming and other economic interests, plus the region-wide scale issues with the federal government, the 4 states, and the 13 tribes, and it functions. So it's totally doable here.
Let me just add, in case
Please.
you glossed over this, that the purpose of having the state and federal project managers in the center of the circle, as you described, is to promote this shared understanding. In no way does this suggest that we get to take over the roles of the regulators.
No.
He also suggested you were the bank.
Well, obviously. Buy them lunch after this.
I didn't mean that
only
you
banks
turn the
that's full.
keys of the kingdom over to DWR, the Bureau.
No,
That's not going to happen.
that's not going to happen. Well, thank you all very much. We have to leave some time for the next panel. Be sure to stay where you're seated while we're going to re-mic here very quickly.